Alright, what we got going on today is we have a classic encounter from 1890. Yeah, from 1890 in Oregon, close to Brookings, Oregon, on the Chetco River. Now this is a hair-raising story about a logging operation that ran into a Sasquatch, and they did the Sasquatch wrong, so he turned around and showed them who was boss. Wait until you guys hear about this story. It's a really interesting story. One thing about this though, they don't give many details about the location, so I can't really pinpoint the location. I can just show you a general area of where this might have occurred. Now the Chetco River flows through western Oregon, so I could show you where the river flows through, and from what I gather it was close to Brookings, Oregon, but I'm not too sure about that. They're going to be calling Sasquatch or Bigfoot apes because they didn't know really what they were back then. You know, back in 1890 they already knew about apes. They didn't know about mountain gorillas. People didn't find out about mountain gorillas until the early 1900s. But they knew about other gorillas, and they knew about chimpanzees and orangutans. So the only thing they can compare these things with were apes. So that's why they're going to call them apes, because that's all they knew. So I just want to make sure you guys are clear about that. So before you guys leave me comments, they're not apes, they're not apes. I'm not saying they're apes. I'm just reading the story word for word the way it is, and that's how I do it. I'm not into changing the story or the words in the story just because nowadays we think of things differently. You know, this is how they thought back then, so this is how I read the story. I'm not into embellishing. I'm not into changing history or any of that. But now I'm going to show you that location really quick, and after that we are going to get into this story. Right here is where this incident occurred, in my opinion, because they say something about a steep ravine, and there's a steep ravine right in this area, and I'll show you that right here. As you guys can see, there it is right there. It's a steep ravine they're talking about. So most likely it happened right in here guys, is my best guess. And you know, usually I like to try to pinpoint it a little better than this, but with this incident occurring in 1890, they don't give a whole bunch of clues on to the location. So you guys are gonna have to bear with me on this one. Just gonna be able to show you a general area, and that's about it for this video. But the story itself is the main star of this video. Wait till you guys hear what happened to these loggers. The logging operation was a small one, employing a dozen men whose family lived in tents alongside the river. For several weeks nothing unusual happened. Occasionally garbage cans were overturned at night by marauding bears. Sometimes the beasts were so troublesome that an armed guard stood by while the loggers felled the big trees. At the campsite, mothers watched their young children closely and forbade older boys and girls to play hide-and-seek in the forest. Even when they swam in the shallow river, an adult kept a sharp lookout for bears. Then one morning, enormously large human footprints were discovered along the riverbanks. The loggers laughingly accused one another of having feet as big as chopping blocks. Everyone from the oldest to the youngest in camp measured his footprints against those of the unknown visitor. Since no one's feet were that large, one question was bandied about repeatedly. If those weren't a bear's tracks, then whose were they? Someone said there was a wild man living way up the river. He was an irritable old devil who threatened to shoot anyone who approached his cabin. No matter how bad the weather was, he never wore a hat or boots. He was always bareheaded and barefooted. Barefooted? Then the tracks were his. With the mystery of the tracks happily solved, the people promptly forgot them. But several nights later, the sound of eerie whistling and angry shrieks wakened them. In every tent, men bounded out of bed and grabbed their guns, assuming that there was a wounded bear nearby. No one lighted a lamp for fear of attracting the beast, and frightened children were warned not to cry. The spine-chilling noises went on and on. Sometimes they seemed close by, other times from the direction of the road or the river. But finally the sounds faded into the distance, and quiet returned to the dark campsite. At daybreak, the men gathered to talk. They debated whether it was a bear or mountain lion. To satisfy themselves and ease their families' worries, a half-dozen men searched for bear or mountain lion tracks. they found no mountain lion spoor at all and no fresh bear tracks. However, at the edge of the clearing, beyond the first stand of trees and dense undergrowth, they came upon more of the giant-sized human footprints. The men debated whether it was the old recluse. They agreed they had to catch the demented man before he killed someone, so as quickly as possible, the search party backtracked along the line of footprints. These led them out to the road several hundred yards above the camp and up the road to the logging site. Here they found where the wild man had emerged from the forest into the open area and had prowled about tree stumps, piles of bushes, and machinery used in loading the logs onto wagons. Then the men had a nasty shock. Massive, unwieldy tree limbs, far too heavy for one man to handle, had been pulled out of the tangled waste piles and either tossed aside like matchsticks or used to beat on the machinery. The searchers followed the tracks back down the road into the forest. For the first time, they noticed shrubs torn to pieces and saplings uprooted and whacked to shreds. This explained the thudding and snapping sounds heard during the night. The footprints circled the camp, went down the well-beaten path to the river, turning back to the road, went down it a half a mile, and turned off into the forest. The men pressed on as far as they dared. However, when the tracks plunged deep into a steep ravine, they stopped. The gloomy depths provided too many hiding places for a demented killer. The Chetco Indians believed there were man-animals in the woods. The logger informed his friends. He had heard the story from a white man whom the Indians trusted enough to take into their confidence. They claimed that for generations they had shared their hunting grounds with fierce-looking hairy creatures that walked upright like men. The strange beings were not human nor animal, neither friendly nor hostile. They were just simply there, like every other man or wild creatures, so the Indians left them alone. But very late on the third night, the frightening sounds were once again heard, faintly from far off in the woods. People jerked up in bed. As the whistling and screaming grew louder, in every tent men pulled on their trousers and boots and readied their guns. Obviously, the night howler was coming closer and closer. When he seemed only 50 feet away, one man took desperate action. Hastily fashioning a torch of oily rags and kindling, he set it to fire. Torch in one hand and rifle in the other, he raced into the woods. Meantime, the man's wife called for help. Within minutes, several men stumbled towards her in the darkness. They groaned when they learned that their comrade had gone into the woods alone. None hesitated to follow, but minutes passed while one dashed off to fetch a lantern and others supplied themselves with extra cartridges. Finally, the party headed into the forest in the direction from which the awful sounds were heard. They had covered only a short distance when the whistling and shrieking stopped. The men halted and listened. There was a long silence. Then an outburst of bestial yowling, followed by human screams. Thinking their friend was being attacked, the men fought through the undergrowth, the man with the lantern in the lead. Moments later, their comrade appeared and collapsed in their arms. At first, he was too terrified to speak. His companions fired their guns to drive off the howler, then waited patiently for the poor man to gasp out the details. He said that by torchlight he had followed the line of giant-sized footprints and suddenly came upon a huge creature covered with hair. A bear? No, an ape! A monstrous ape, 7 or 8 feet tall, 2 axe handles wide across the shoulders, with beady yellow eyes and bared teeth. The torchlight must have blinded it because it stood stock still, one hand shading its eyes. Then it let out a tremendous roar. The man hurled his torch into its face, but instead of shooting it, the frightened man ran screaming towards camp. While his companions did not doubt his word, they asked anxiously if he was sure the beast was an ape. Yes, he was positive. It really looked like an ape? Yes, an ape. Did it have fangs? You bet. Claws? The man said sarcastically that he hadn't stayed around long enough to study the brute, but after thinking it over, he said it had hands like a man, only twice as large and covered with hair right down to the fingernails. After that, they all decided to return to camp. After much discussion, the loggers agreed to take turns standing guard day and night until the ape was captured or shot. 2 men would patrol the campsite on 2-hour watches while the rest worked or slept. Since women present knew how to handle a gun, their assistance during the daylight hours was welcomed. The older boys and girls offered to gather firewood so that a large fire could be kept blazing all night. Nothing unusual happened during the day or the early night hours, but the 2 whose turn came about 2 a.m. asked the men they were about to relieve to stand by and wait. They wanted to slip into the woods and really search for the ape. Reluctantly, the one patrol agreed to stand by while the relief party set out on their ape hunt. The hunters carried a small lantern because without some light they could not follow any tracks, but they were careful to keep the light at ground level. Their rifles were loaded and the safety catches thumbed back. Not long after, they came upon bits of charred cloth amidst a welter of huge footprints. This must be where their friend had thrown his torch at the monster. Yes, there were his boot marks. After examining the area closely, they found where the ape had turned deeper into the forest instead of backtracking to the road. They followed gingerly, step by step, over and around ferns, shrubs, outcroppings, and rocks and massive tree trunks. What happened next can only be guessed. Apparently, the ape-like creature loomed before them. One man started shooting while the other put down the lantern and shot too. The patrol on guard at the campsite heard the volley of shots. They pounded each other happily. The hunters had killed the beast, but then they listened in mounting horror to frantic cries for help, which were drowned out by the horrendous shrieks and roaring. The awful noises continued for some moments and then faded out. The silence was even more frightening to the guards. They shouted for help and soon were surrounded by armed loggers and their wives. After a hasty explanation, all the men plunged into the woods, leaving the women to build up the fires and protect the children. The searchers shouted, swung lanterns, and fired the guns so that their friends would know help was on the way. After advancing some distance, they stopped briefly and called to the men. When neither responded, they fired shots. No answering shots were heard. Once more, the party advanced. Before long, they came upon a gruesome sight. Their friends were dead. Judging from bloodstains, their bodies had been slammed against tree trunks and torn to pieces. A trail of blood-smeared footprints led off into the forest. The beast obviously had been wounded, but no man present was willing to track it through the dark forest. Some did volunteer to gather up the remains of their unfortunate comrades, while others returned to camp for blankets and to break the sad news. Within 24 hours, the campsite was deserted. The logging operation moved to another location. A professional hunter with trained hounds was hired to assist hunters in tracking down the savage beast. It was never captured, nor its voice ever heard again. The most people could hope for was that it had crawled into a well-hidden lair and died. Alright, so there you folks have it. Another crazy story about a Sasquatch and some loggers that come into a conflict, and guess who wins? It seems to me that every time there's conflict between humans and a Sasquatch, the Sasquatch definitely gets the better of the two. You know, it definitely wins that conflict. I mean, imagine that. Imagine being back in 1890. You just have lanterns, you just have old rifles and stuff, no, semi-automatic guns or anything like that. and this beast just tearing people up. Just like going through them, like ripping them to shreds. I would definitely pack up my family and get the hell out of there also. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely would do that. It is said that in or around 1855, a band of Choctaws in what is now LaFleur County and farmers in what is now Arkansas were experiencing some terrifying events. It all began in a rather benign way with the theft of vegetables, a few head of livestock, and other foodstuff by stealthy bandits in the night. The thieves were cagey, quiet, and never seen. They were also smart, as somehow they never ventured into Choctaw encampments on nights when watchmen were in place. Neither did the bandits ever fall into the trap set for them by farmers outside of Indian territory. Those charged with finding and capturing these marauders began to develop a begrudging respect for the wildness of their adversaries as time went by and the petty thefts continued. While the thefts were annoying and did cause some hardships, neither the Choctaw or the neighboring Anglo farmers were afraid of the food bandits. However, things changed once women and children began to go missing. Spurred by reports of these kidnappings, a group of 30 Choctaw cavalrymen was organized to hunt down the abductors. The group was led by Joshua LaFleur, a man of mixed Choctaw and French blood, who was deeply respected by his fellow tribesmen. Also joining the search party was a Choctaw warrior named Hamas Tubi and his 6 sons. The Tubis were huge men, all approaching 7 feet in height and weighing in at more than 300 pounds each, and were regarded as fierce warriors and expert horsemen. The Tubis were so effective in mounted warfare that despite their massive size, they became known as the Light Horsemen. The contingent of searchers, armed to the teeth, set out into the region known today as the McCurtain County Wilderness Area to search for the kidnappers. After riding all day, the searchers finally arrived in the area where they believed the bandits to be hiding. LaFleur brought his troops to a halt, stood up in his stirrups, and surveyed the area with a spyglass. It is unclear exactly what LaFleur saw, but whatever it was, he ordered his men to charge towards a stand of pines roughly 500 yards distant. LaFleur and the Tubi men led the attack. As the troops closed the distance between themselves and the stand of pines where the kidnappers were thought to be hiding, they were assaulted by a tremendous stench, the unmistakable odor of decay and decomposition. The horses of most of the men began to buck and rear, tossing their riders. Only the mounts of LaFleur and the Tubi men were disciplined enough to remain composed, allowing the 8 men to continue through the pines. As the men cleared the small wooden patch, they came upon a large earthen mound. Scattered across the mound were the bodies of children and women in various stages of decomposition. LaFleur and the Tubis caught a glimpse of a number of the murderers fleeing into the tree line on the opposite side of the mound. Only 3 of the killers stood their ground to meet the charge of the Light Horsemen. It was at this time that the cavalrymen realized they were not going up against any human foe. Rather, standing before them, snarling and beating their chest, were 3 huge, hair-covered creatures. Despite what must have been a shocking sight to him, LaFleur drew his pistol and saber, spurred his mount, and charged. As LaFleur approached the nearest ape, it took a mighty swipe and struck his horse in the head, killing it instantly. LaFleur managed to roll off the falling horse, quickly jumped to his feet, and fired multiple shots into the chest of the creature. Once his pistol was empty, LaFleur attacked the ape with his saber, opening up a gaping wound on the animal, which roared in rage and pain. LaFleur's assault on the creature was so quick, and the shock of seeing hairy-covered monsters so great that the Tubi men hesitated, completely stupefied before entering the fray. This delay allowed one of the other 2 apes to get behind LaFleur, who was intensely focused on the ape he had engaged. The second beast grabs LaFleur's head with 2 huge hands and ripped it from his shoulders. The horrible sight jolted the Tubi warriors into action, and they opened fire on the 3 Sasquatches with 50 caliber Sharps buffalo rifles. 2 of the beasts were killed instantly, dropping in their tracks. The 3rd creature was wounded but turned and fled before the lethal shot could be fired. Robert Tubi, only 18 years old but already 6'11" and well over 300 pounds, spurred his horse, reined down the injured ape, and dispatched him with his hunting knife. As the rest of the troop, after gathering their panicked horses, joined them, the Light Horsemen surveyed the area. The bodies of dead women and children, most partially devoured, littered the area. The smell of decay, along with the terrible odor of the beast's feces, caused many of the men to vomit. After composing themselves, the men gathered the remains of the unfortunate women and children and buried them. They also buried their leader, Joshua LaFleur. As for the 3 ape-like monsters, their bodies were placed upon a huge bonfire and burned. Their hellish task complete, the Choctaw warriors returned to Tuscaloosa, where it is said even the mighty Tubi men were plagued by terrible nightmares for years afterward. Crazy! Was that not a crazy story right there? Good Lord. Imagine having your head ripped off your body like that. Wow. That's just something else. You know, people say that the Sasquatch or Bigfoot are always peaceful. Well, not according to this story. There's actually quite a few stories on finding out where these things aren't so peaceful. And like I've mentioned before, I think it's probably comes down to individual personalities. You know, just like a person or a dog. I mean, some dogs are nice, some dogs will bite your hand off, you know? Alright, welcome back to WILLSTAR Monsters and Mysteries. I have a really good one for you today. The Mountain Devils of Mount St. Helens. I've been doing a lot of research and have found some very old newspaper articles on what these creatures are from a Native American's point of view in oral history. A few different tribes from the Northwest give their oral traditions and their stories. They go into a lot of things that you might find fascinating, including how they hunt, communicate, and make themselves almost impossible to see. I've also found a few newspaper articles from the 1960s about encounters near or on Mount St. Helens, including an expert alpine skier that was chased while on his skis down the mountain. I'm going to give you the famous Ape Canyon encounter that occurred on the slopes of Mount St. Helens, where in 1924, 4 miners were attacked while in their cabin by these mountain devils. I have found an old newspaper article from the 1920s from a reporter that was one of the first ones to Spirit Lake after the Ape Canyon attack happened. He spoke to the forest ranger at Spirit Lake, who was one of the first people to speak to the miners after the incident. His description of the miners' reactions are very, very telling. If you like this kind of content, think about subscribing. And as always, everyone, if you liked the video, smash that like button for me. You know how much YouTube loves that. And another thing, let's fill the comment section with your thoughts on what these creatures are. Do you agree with the Native Americans, or do you think there's something else? Alright, that's enough about that. Let's go ahead and get into this one. The Longview Washington Times, August 1963. Ape Canyon holds unsolved mystery. Ape Canyon, the legendary home of the hairy apes of Mount St. Helens, apparently swallowed an experienced mountaineer and expert skier in May 1950. No trace of Jim Carter, 32, who disappeared from a 20-member climbing party from Seattle was found, although teams of the Northwest's most proficient mountain rescue units combed the area for weeks. Carter's complete disappearance is an unsolved mystery to this day, declared Bob Lee, well-known Portland mountaineer who is a member of the exclusive Worldwide Alpine Club, a leader of the 1961 Himalayan expedition, and advisor to the 1963 American expedition. Lee said he had never seen one of the monsters, but that there certainly was evidence that there was something strange on the high slopes of the mountain. He was convinced of this during the search for Carter, he said. Dr. Otto Trott, Lee Stark, and I finally came to the conclusion that the mountain devils got him, said Lee seriously. Lee, a member of the Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue Unit at the time, describes the hunt for Carter in Ape Canyon as the most eerie experience I have ever had. He said that every time he got cut off from the rest of the searchers during the long hunt, he got the feeling that somebody was watching me. I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. It was eerie. I was unarmed, except for my ice axe, and believe me, I never let go of that. At this point in Lee's story, I could feel my own hair standing up a bit. Ready to shoulder packs for a safari to Ape Canyon to determine whether there is any truth to the ape stories, I began to feel a little dubious about the whole expedition. The rest of Lee's tale about the Seattle man's disappearance didn't do much to reassure me. It seems that the missing man Carter had climbed Mount St. Helens with a group from Seattle on a warm, clear Sunday. On the way down the mountain, he left the other climbers near a landmark called Dog's Head at the 8,000-foot level. Carter told them he would ski around to the left and take a picture of the group as they skied down to the timberline.
That was the last time that anyone saw Carter. The next morning, searchers found a discarded film box at the point where he had taken a picture. From here, Carter evidently took off down the mountain in a wild, death-defying dash, taking chances that no skier of his caliber would ever take, unless something was terribly wrong or he was being pursued, says Lee, who was one of the first searchers to reach Carter's ski tracks. He jumped over 2 or 3 large crevasses and apparently was going like the devil when Carter's tracks reached the precipitous sides of Ape Canyon. The searchers were amazed to see that Carter had been in such a hurry that he went right down the steep canyon walls, but they did not find him at the bottom of the canyon as they expected. We combed the canyon, one end to the other, for 5 days. Sometimes there were as many as 5 people in a search party, but no sign of Carter or of his equipment was ever found, Lee says. After 2 weeks, the search was called off. Lee, who has lived in the Northwest most of his life, recalls there are about 25 different reports of people attacked by ape-like men in the St. Helens and Cascade areas over a 20-year period. One was the group of Boy Scouts from Centralia, he said. As near as he could remember, several of the boys who were taken off the mountain were hysterical after being attacked by the mountain devils. Director Dick Whitney of the Regional Boy Scout office in Olympia, Washington, promised to look for a record of the incident. To our surprise, he called back to say that he had located the name of the leader and the troop involved in the incident. It was a troop under the late Scoutmaster Pease from Centralia, he said. Whitney promised to have Peace's son, who works for the state of Washington, call the Journal as soon as he returns from vacation. Miners, scouts, Indians, mountaineers, and most recently, an editor and other reliable Portland residents. The list of persons who have seen the hairy apes of Mount St. Helens is very impressive. The Oregon Journal, 1962. Are the legendary hairy giants of Mount St. Helens, which reportedly terrorized early visitors to that area on the march again. Strange, unidentified monsters reportedly sighted by 2 different groups of Portland visitors to the Washington area during the past weekend brought knowing nods from old-timers. These things have been seen before. 3 persons driving along a remote mountain road east of the Cascade Wilderness area early Sunday said they saw a 10-foot white hairy figure moving rapidly along the roadside. It was caught in the headlights as their car passed, but they were too frightened to turn around to investigate. Another Portland woman and her husband fishing on the Lewis River south of Mount St. Helens saw a huge beige figure bigger than any human along the bank of the river. As they watched it moved into the thicket with a lumbering gait. These reports are shades of the famous Mount St. Helens apes, according to retired Forest Ranger Marshall Sternison, who was stationed at the ranger station for many years. He has listened to and investigated many reports about the strange monsters that supposedly inhabit the slopes and the remote wild country around the beautiful mountain. Sternison is now stationed in Portland, but while he was in charge of the mountain ranger station, he instigated an investigation into the history and legends of the St. Helens area. This investigation revealed that the stories of the hairy giants on Mount St. Helens are older than the white man's inhabitation of the Northwest. The Klallam Indian tribe claims these giants are the ferocious Silatic Indians, a tribe of renegade marauder-like people who live like animals in the caves and lava tunnels in the high Cascades. Evidently, one of the first white man's encounters with these creatures was a wild one. In 1924, Marion Smith and 5 miners rushed into Kelso, Washington to report that a band of great ape-like creatures had attacked them in the middle of the night. Smith said they had been working in a mine on the east side of Mount St. Helens. They encountered some of the hairy giants on the mountainside during the daytime and fired on them to halt an attack at that time. One of the huge creatures was believed slain, and the body rolled over a cliff into a deep ravine, destined thereafter to be known as Ape Canyon, located on the southeastern slope of Mount St. Helens. The attack continued after dark. Smith reported to the Cowlitz County Sheriff the hairy giant ape men pelted their cabin all night with rocks and danced and screamed until daylight. They described the mountain devils as being at least 7 foot tall and covered with long black hair. Their arms were long and trailed, they said. The Great Ape Hunt of 1924 followed, but no apes were ever found. Reference to apes is the white man's term. The local Indians say that they are renegade outcasts, a type of people. The sheriff led a large party out of Kelso on an eerie trip to Mount St. Helens with all participants armed. They found huge footprints around the miners' cabin, but never saw what made the footprints. Nevertheless, the miners never went back to mining in the area. Inspired by this white man's legend, an employee at the ranger station later had a lot of fun with a large foot form. From time to time, he left its imprints on the lakeshore around Spirit Lake. This caused a lot of excitement, and later, when someone discovered all the tracks were of the same right foot, he admitted the hoax. However, the hairy giant legend persists today, and more fuel has been added to the fire from time to time as intermittent reports have come in about persons sighting strange figures on the mountainsides or hearing weird noises in the wilderness. Alright, so now I have Fred Beck's own words about the encounter that happened at Ape Canyon in 1924. If you guys don't know, he was one of the miners in the cabin. First of all, I wish to give an account of the attack and tell of the famous incident of July 1924, when the hairy apes attacked our cabin. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the Mount St. Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had, from time to time, come across large tracks by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claim, the Vander White. It was 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens near a deep canyon, now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after an account of the incident reached the newspapers. Hank, a great hunter and good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks. The tracks were large, and we knew that no other animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches. It was in the middle of July, and we had received a good assay on our claim, and everybody was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he should take me to town to see a dentist. But he was so enthused in the prospect of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. We had all come up in his Ford, and I had no way to get back to town unless he took me. So, when we went back to the cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hotcakes. Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, particular whistle each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on his chest. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring about 100 yards from our cabin to get some water and suggested we take our rifles, to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away on the other side of a little canyon standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree. And at the same time Hank shot, I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that was quite a distance to see bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party, and we all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning, as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves. We had made it very sturdy. It stood for years afterward and was visited by many sightseers until a few years ago when it was burned to the ground. The circumstances of the fire I do not recall. In the cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which 2 could sleep feet to feet, the rest of us sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin, we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin, so darkness found us all in the cabin, more calm now, and my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around puffing on pipes and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcome bed, and then soon fell asleep. About midnight, we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking, but the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from between the logs and it fell across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, my gun being a .30-30 Winchester, which I still have. I helped to get the chinking off of him and he jumped to his feet. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns, Hank squinting through the space left by the chinking. By actual account, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. This was the first of the famous attack, of which so much has been written in Washington and Oregon papers throughout the years. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin, and say some even fell through the roof. But this was not quite the case. There were very few large rocks around in that area. It is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof, but hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. Some accounts state I was hit in the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is not true. The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking if we had chosen to. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, but this was pretty much an impossibility. As previously stated, the cabin was a sturdy main building. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. One had a pistol, which is still in my family's possession. The others clutched their rifles. They seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals in between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures being close to the cabin reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright so that it caught on the log. And at the same time, Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go, and I pulled the handle back in and put the axe in a safe place. A humorous thing that I will remember is Hank singing, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious, and sang under the impression that the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times and it toppled over the cliff down into the gorge, some 400 feet below. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible and not bother to pack our supplies or equipment out. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than lose our lives. We were all only too glad to agree. We brought out only which we could get in our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the beginnings to anyone, and they agreed, but Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went into the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." That was just what Hank did, to the puzzlement of the ranger. Alright, so here is the ranger's side of the story when the miners come in after their encounter. It's really interesting, especially how you can infer from their reaction that he noticed that something really did happen to these guys, or their behavior wouldn't have been like that, I don't think. So that's just my opinion. Let's get to it. The morning in 1924 at the Spirit Lake Ranger Station was beautiful, like a morning in this high country, Bill Welch, 68, recalled. What made this morning so different was the man coming from the direction of the ranger station with a rifle in his hand. Welch could see the visitor was pretty wild-eyed, and he recognized him as a man who had a cabin with several others about 5 or 6 miles from the station at the head of what was called Muddy Creek. "Well, I got him," the man said as he slowed down in front of the forest guard Welch. "Got who or what?" "The mountain devil." "You mean a cougar?" "No, the mountain devil." "You mean a wolverine?" "No, the mountain devil." Welch, standing outside the barn, eyeing the newcomer warily, recalled him as a man who had been at the station 2 or 3 weeks earlier. Permits were needed to build a fire outside the campgrounds of Spirit Lake, and this man in his 50s had stopped in and asked permission to build a fire in his cabin. Permits were not needed for this. In the course of the earlier conversation, The man told Welch that he and several others had a mine near the cabin. He also volunteered the information that mountain devils had been trailing and bothering the men in the last several years. He hadn't seen these devils, but had viewed some of their tracks. Welch had thought this was a little far-fetched. He didn't think that there were any wolves or wolverines in the area. "It's the first I've heard of it," he said. "If you run into any of those mountain devils, let me know." "I will," the mountain miner said. Now, standing facing the gun-carrying mountain man, Welch began wondering if he could get close enough to grab the rifle and started worrying about his wife at the ranger station. Had this definitely disturbed newcomer murdered her? As the talk continued, Welch was relieved to see his wife come out the door of the ranger station. The visitor was insisting that he had shot the mountain devil and that it had slid over a bluff at the cabin. He also said that his partners were in the car near the ranger station after coming down from the cabin with him. Welch still thought the man had blown his top, and when he went over to the touring car, which carried 3 men in front and 2 in the back, he found the others were just as wild as he was, sitting there clutching their guns. The man who had walked over to see Welch vowed that they were going back home and would never come back here again. The 5 left shortly afterward, headed for Kelso. Welch didn't know at the time, but he was getting involved in a key incident of the legend of Mount St. Helens hairy apes. The ape label quickly took predominance over the mountain devils, and the alleged existence of the creature has been a subject of recurrent speculation over the years. Welch talked to his wife, who had been the first person to encounter the departing miners after they left the cabin, and she told him about the man coming to the door with rifle across his shoulder, an incident she still remembers vividly today. The miner's eyes were glazed from some evidently shocking experience as he informed Mrs. Welch, "We got him! We got him!" "Well, what?" "The mountain devil." There was a pause, and the miner explained. "Well, we know your husband told us to let him know if we ever saw any, so I stopped to tell him we saw one and killed it, but we are going out and never coming back." Miss Welch hardly knew what he was talking about, but told the gun toter that her husband was out at the barn, and he walked towards the barn to meet Welch. After the carload of men had left, Welch called Jim Huffman, the district manager at Amboy, and told him what had happened. He still wondered if the miners might have encountered a wolverine. This is a vicious little animal that can wreck cabins and destroys what it doesn't eat. There were rumors of wolverines on Mount St. Helens about this time, but no one, as so far as the forest guard knew, had seen one. More details were soon forthcoming from the miners, who were interviewed by a reporter after they had reached Kelso on July 12, 1924. "Fight with the Big Apes," reported by miners, was one headline on the reporter's account, which he termed the strangest story to come from the Cascade Mountains. The returning miners had encountered the fabled mountain devils, or mountain gorillas of Mount St. Helens, according to the reporter, who also stated the men had been prospecting a claim on the Muddy, a branch of the Lewis River about 8 miles from Spirit Lake. They saw 4 of the huge animals, which are about 7 feet tall, weigh about 400 pounds, and walk erect. Smith and his companions have seen the tracks of the animals several times in the last 6 years, and the Indians have told of mountain devils for 60 years, but none of the animals ever has been seen before. Smith met up with one of the animals and fired at it with a revolver. Thursday, Fred Beck shot one, the body falling over a precipice. That night, the animals bombarded the cabin where the men were, with large showers of rocks, many of them large ones, knocking chunks out of the log cabin. Many of the rocks fell through a hole, and 2 of the rocks struck Beck, one of them rendering him unconscious for nearly 2 hours. The animals have the appearance of huge gorillas. They are covered with long black hair. Their ears are about 4 inches long and stick straight up. They have 4 toes, short and stubby. The tracks are 13 to 14 inches long. These tracks have been seen by forest rangers and prospectors for years. The prospectors built a new cabin this year, and it is believed it is close to a cave occupied by the animals. Mr. Smith believes he knows the location of the cave. On the evening that the news was sent by wire from Kelso, Welch recalled, Frank Lynch, a Seattle newspaperman, and Bert Hammerstrom, a freelance writer and brother-in-law of Clarence Darrow, arrived by car at the Spirit Lake Ranger Station. They had quite a trip in reaching the place, as 9 hours were required for a drive from Castle Rock to Spirit Lake in 1924, Welch remembered. He said the road was not too good, and in some places a driver had to try 3 or 4 roads before finding the right one. A side road might meander off into nothing. Welch later recalled the date as July 14th, when the news had been received in Seattle, and when he reached the ranger station, he and his friends were ready with a lot of questions about the apes, who reportedly had rained rocks as large as a man's head on the miner's cabin, and as Welch told the story, had tried to pry the cabin into the Smith Creek abyss. Alright, so now we're going to get into the Native American origins of the Sasquatch and what they believe these creatures to be. How they live, how they hunt, all those things from a Native American perspective, which to me carries way more weight. They've been around the creatures way longer than we have. So I have a newspaper article from 1924 that interviews a bunch of Native American tribal elders and a few other articles also. So this is going to be really interesting. Let's get into it. Mountain devils discovered at Mount St. Helens near Kelso are none other than the Siatik tribe, says George Totsky, Klallam tribal leader. Siatik is a Klallam pronunciation. All of the tribes pronounce it Siatko. The Indians of the Northwest have kept the existence of Siatiks a secret, partly because they know no white man would believe them, and the Indian, known for his honesty and truthfulness, does not like to be called a liar, and partly because the Northwest Indians are ashamed of the Asiatic tribe. The Mountain Devils, or guerrillas, who bombarded the Prospector Shack on Mount St. Helens in 1924, according to the description of the miners, are none other than the Siatik tribe, with whom every Indian in the Northwest is familiar, said Totsky. The Siatiks were last heard of by the Klallam Indians about 1900, and it was believed by the present-day Indians that they had become extinct. The Siatik tribe also make their home in caves in the heart of the wilderness on Vancouver Island, and in the Olympic Range, in particular Mount St. Helens. As described by the Klallam Indians, the Siatiks are 7 to 8 feet tall. They have hairy bodies like the bear. They are great hypnotists and kill their game by stunning them with hypnotic power. They also have the gift of ventriloquism, throwing their voices at great distances, and can imitate any bird in the Northwest. They have a very keen sense of humor, Totsky added. In the past generations, they stole many Indian women and Indian babies. They lived entirely in the mountain, coming down to the shores only when they wanted a change of diet. The Quinaults claim they generally come once a year to the Quinault River about fall. The Klallam say they favor the river area near Brennan on Mount Hood. After having their fill of fresh salmon, they stole dry salmon from the Indian women. The Siatik tribe are harmless if left alone. The Klallam tribe, however, at one time several generations ago, killed a young man of the Siatik tribe to their everlasting sorrow. For they killed off a whole branch of the Klallam tribe but one, and he was merely left to tell the tale to the other Klallams up sound. The Klallam Indians believed that the Siatik tribe had become extinct. It is 15 years since their tracks were last seen and recognized on the Brennan River. Prior to that time, many Klallam Indians have met and talked with men of this strange tribe. For the Siatiks talk the strange tongue of the Klallams, which is said to have originated from the bear tongue. The Quinault Indians, however, claim that Fred Pope of the Quinault tribe and George Hyasman of the Satsop tribe were fishing about 15 miles up the Quinault River in the month of September 4 years ago, 1920, when they were visited by the Siatiks. The two Indians had caught a lot of steelhead trout, which they left in their canoe, and the Siatiks stole these. Henry Napoleon of the Klallam tribe is the only Indian who was ever invited to the home of the Siatik tribe. It was while Napoleon was visiting relatives on the British Columbia coast about 30 years ago, that would have made the year roughly 1895, that he met a Siatik while hunting. The giant Indian then invited him to their home, which is in the very heart of the wilderness on Vancouver Island. Napoleon claims that they live in a large cave. He was treated with every courtesy and told of some of their secrets. He claims that the giant Indians made themselves invisible by strange medicine that they rub all over their bodies, and that they were able to cause great fear by hypnotic power, and had the gift of ventriloquism, to mimic the owl and throw their voices. Some Indians claim that during the process of evolution, when the Indian was changing from animal to man, the Siatik did not fully observe the soul power, and thus he became an anomaly in the process of evolution. The Indians of the Northwest are of the belief that the mountain devils found at Mount St. Helens are indeed the Siatik Indians, and it is generally their custom to frighten persons who have displeased them by throwing rocks at them. Okay, here's another article from 1924. Every Indian, especially of the Puget Sound tribes, is familiar with the history of these strange giant Indians, as they are sometimes referred by local Indians. Shaker Indians of northwestern Oregon related to the writer their experience with the Asiatic Indians. Oregon and Washington Indians agree that Asiatic Indians are not less than 7 feet tall, and some have been seen that were fully 8 feet tall. They have hairy bodies like a bear. This is to protect them from the cold, as they live entirely in the mountains. They kill their game entirely by hypnotism. They have great supernatural powers. They also have the gift of ventriloquism and have deceived many ordinary Indians by throwing their voices. These Indians talk, beside the bear language of the Klallam tribe and the bird language. The writer was told by Oregon Indians during his research work, among them last year, that the Asiatic tribe can imitate any bird of the Northwest, especially the blue jay, and that they have a very keen sense of smell. Oregon Indians at times have been greatly humiliated by the Asiatics' vulgar sense of humor. The Asiatics play practical jokes upon them and steal their Indian women. Sometimes an Indian woman comes back. More often, she does not. And it is even said by some northwestern Indians they have a strain of the Asiatic blood in them. Oregon and Washington Indians differ in regard to the Asiatic's home. Oregon Indians assert they made their home in or near Mount Rainier, while the Puget Sound Indians say they live in the heart of the wilderness at Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Henry Napoleon of the Klallam tribe came upon one of the members of the Asiatic tribe while out hunting on Vancouver Island. He related the story to the writer. I had been visiting relatives near Duncan, British Columbia, and while there I had been told many stories of the Asiatics by the Cowichan tribe of British Columbia, and warned by them not to go too far into the wilderness. However, in following a buck I had wounded, I went further in than I expected. It was at twilight when I came across an animal that I believed to be a big bear. But as I aimed at him with my gun, he looked and spoke to me in my own tongue. He was about 7 feet tall and his body very hairy. As he invited me to sit down, he told me that I came upon him unaware and that his mind had been projected to distant relatives of his. Otherwise, he would never have been seen. After we talked for some time, he invited me to the Asiatic's home. Though it was now dark, yet the giant Indian followed the trail very easily. Then we began an underground trail, and after hours of travel we came to a large cave, which he said was the home of his people, and that they lived during the winter in different caves on Vancouver Island. He told me that the reason they were not seen very much was because they had a strange medicine that they rubbed all over their bodies, so it made them invisible, and that combined with their hypnotic powers made them very strong Tamanawis men. They also told me that they could talk almost any Indian language in the Northwest. The next day they led me out, and just at twilight I came out of the underground trail, and they accompanied me to within a mile of the Indian village I was staying at. The Asiatic tribe is harmless if left alone. However, if one of their members is injured or killed, they generally take 12 lives for one. This the Indians of the Northwest have learned. And even though the Asiatic tribe steal all their dried meat or salmon, or even steal their women, the Puget Sound Indians will not try to retaliate. For once the Klallam tribe in righteous indignation captured a young man of the Asiatic tribe at Seebeck, Washington, and took him across the Hood Canal to Brennan, where the other Klallam Indians were camped. Quenchton, the writer's own grandfather, kept telling the Klallams to be careful of the Asiatic's supernatural powers, but he was only laughed at. It was later told by Queechan that while they were 20 yards from the shore, the young Asiatic made a mighty leap and immediately made for the mountains. Queanchuk warned his people that they should move, but again he was laughed at. That very night, the Asiatic tribe came down and killed every Klallam there but Queechan, who had moved his family across the canal. Coastal tribes call them Silatics, sometimes spelled Asiatic. They describe beings that roam the Cascade Mountain Range, sleeping by day and hunting by night. The giant hairy creatures were known to carry off horses and people. Indian lore describes them as members of the fierce Asiatic tribe, a band of renegades who look like giant apes and live like wild animals in secluded caves high in the Cascade Mountain Range. Children were taught never to say their name, because if the beast heard their names, they would come and capture a human from the tribe. Elkanah Walker, a missionary to the Spokane tribe, described local belief in a letter written to the missionary board in April 1840. Walker reported that local tribes believed in a race of giants that inhabited a mountain west of their lands. The giants lived near the top of the mountain, which was covered with perpetual snow. Since they could not see in daylight, they hunted and worked at night. The men were thieves who came to people's lodges and kidnapped them as they slept. Victims were placed under skins and taken to the creatures' homes without even being awakened. When humans did awaken, they were lost and distorted and had no sense of direction, their way home totally unknown. This being left tracks 1.5 feet in length, possessing a great strength. This beast has been known to carry 2 or 3 logs at one time across their backs. Often they stole salmon from fishing nets during the night and devoured the fish raw. People who were awake when the giants came knew they were nearby by the overwhelming strong stench they gave off. It was not uncommon for the creatures to come at night, give 3 whistles, and then throw stones at the humans' lodges. Elders of the Colville tribe tell of an Indian man who was kidnapped by the great hairy beast. After living with them in their cedar bark shelters for 1 year, he was returned to the spot from which he had been taken. A hunting party found their tribesman at the exact site he had last been seen, in a trance-like state. When he recovered from the hypnotic spell, he told of living with the giant beast, who were great hunters and were able to scamper up impossibly steep cliffs and shoulder heavy loads of game. They hunted by night, leaving their crude bark shelters and returning at daybreak with their prey. The mammoth beings used signals to communicate, sometimes sounding like hooting owls, and they possessed the power to hypnotize their captives. Tribal elder Isabel Arcasa once said during an interview, "The reports of the big footprints are nothing new. We Indian people knew all about these dark people even if we have never seen them." Indians would never go anywhere near places where the Sealatics were known to inhabit. If tribal members ever encountered the Sealatics, they were careful not to offend them, believing that if a man were to harm one of the creatures, they would never forget the incident. They also said that if you ever saw a Sealatic, to show that you were friendly, the way to express this was to wave cedar boughs at the Sealatic, so that it would then know that you had come in peace.